I'm Lois Wasserspring. For 36 years I've taught in the political science department here in the field of comparative politics with a specialization in Latin America. I should say that I formally retired as of July 1, and it's quite amazing for me to think that this is the first September and October since kindergarten that I haven't been in school. But I'm only semi-retired because I'm finally getting to finish 2 books that I've been working on far too long on Mexico, where I've done my principal research over the last 2 decades. I also co-founded Latin American Studies here at Wellesley in the 80s. I developed the first non-European winter session program in Oaxaca, Mexico, where I do field work. The first Latin American semester program, also in Mexico, and I developed for the college our first Latin American internship program, which I directed for several years in Costa Rica. While here at Wellesley, it was very important to me to help students see the richness of Latin American culture and to recognize Latin America as one of the most fascinating regions in the world to study from the point of view of political science. And if Latin America is one of the most fascinating regions, Cuba is one of the most fascinating countries within that fascinating region. So I have the daunting task today in 45 minutes of telling you about Cuba, past, present, and future. So I will begin. As we all know, it was on December 17, 2014, that President Barack Obama and President Raul Castro simultaneously spoke thanking Pope Francis for, quote, helping to broker a historic deal to begin normalizing relations between the United States and Cuba. Under the agreement, full diplomatic relations would be reestablished for the first time since January 1961. And also, according to the agreement, the U.S. President would use his executive authority to relax many aspects of the embargo that had also been first imposed in the early 1960s. Relations between the 2 countries were formally established in July 2015, and as we all remember from last spring, Barack Obama was the first sitting president in 88 years to visit Cuba last March. Let me begin with the prior visit by a sitting U.S. president 88 years prior in 1928, because I think it helps set the framework of understanding aspects of the Cuban Revolution. That president, prior to Barack Obama, was Calvin Coolidge, and he visited Cuba in 1928 during the dictatorship of a man by the name of Gerardo Machado. It is perhaps symbolic that Coolidge arrived in Cuba on a battleship, and he gave the following view of Cuba in one of his speeches after arrival. Today, Cuba is her own sovereign. Her people are independent, free, prosperous, peaceful, and enjoying all the advantages of self-government. Contrast this with the view of the president of the American Federation of Labor, who was in Cuba at that same moment of time. His description of Cuba contrasted very sharply with that of President Coolidge. He said a condition of virtual terrorism existed. The stories of extreme cruelty, assassination, and inhuman treatment were so amazing that they seemed incredible. President Coolidge's visit and his remarks reflect significantly on the long history of U.S. interest and involvement in Cuba. We can go back to Thomas Jefferson in 1821, who remarked, "I candidly confess that I have ever looked on Cuba as the most interesting addition which could ever be made to our system of states." And it was John Quincy Adams, as Secretary of State in 1823, who wrote to the American minister in Madrid, "These islands are natural appendages of the North American continent, and one of them, almost in sight of our shores, from a multitude of considerations, has become an object of transcendent importance to the commercial and political interests of our Union. It is scarcely possible to resist the conviction that the annexation of Cuba to our federal republic will be indispensable to the continuance and integrity of the Union itself." And he ended on an oft-quoted paragraph saying, "There are laws of political as well as of physical gravitation, and if an apple severed by the tempest from its native tree cannot choose but fall to the ground, Cuba, forcibly disjoined from its own unnatural connection with Spain, the colonial power, and incapable of self-support, can gravitate only towards the North American Union, which, by the same law of nature, cannot cast her off from her bosom." 20 years later, in the 1840s, we attempted to give the natural processes of gravitation a push. We offered to buy Cuba from Spain, but Spain turned us down. The Spanish-American War, on the other hand, gave the United States an opportunity to directly influence Cuba, even though Cuba, as a result of the accords which ended the Spanish-American War, was nominally to be an independent republic. Over the objections of Cubans, the U.S. Congress passed what has become known as the Platt Amendment, attached to a Congressional Appropriations Bill in 1903, whose Article 3 stated, "The government of Cuba consents that the United States may exercise the right to intervene for the preservation of Cuban independence and the maintenance of a government adequate for the protection of life, property, and individual liberty." The truth, perhaps the ugly truth, was that Cuba was a virtual possession of the United States for the first half of the 20th century. And it was this, it is important to understand, that inflamed Cuban nationalism, which became the cornerstone of the Revolution of 1959. Two men ruled Cuba in the 20th century, Gerardo Machado in the early part, and then after 1933, Fulgencio Batista. Both ruthless dictators, both with strong and unwavering support from the United States. On the eve of the Cuban Revolution, 75% of Cuba's land was foreign-owned, mainly by Americans. A third of the labor force did not hold full-time jobs, what Cubans referred to as tiempo muerto, dead time, because there was employment during the few months of the sugar harvest, but afterwards there was none. Illiteracy was 42% in rural areas. Half of all Cubans registered some degree of undernourishment. There was only one hospital in all of rural Cuba. But of course, at the time, we and the rest of the world thought that Cuba was the last place to have a revolution because we looked at Havana, not Cuba as a whole. And Havana was a totally Americanized city with more trolleys, radios, and TVs per capita than in France. But 85% of rural Cubans did not have running water. 93% did not have electricity. 200,000 families in agriculture had no land. Americans controlled 80% of the utilities, 90% of the mines, 90% of the cattle ranches, almost 100% of the oil refining industry, 50% of the public railways, and American firms took home 40% of the profits on sugar. On the other hand, give me a guess. How many Cubans did those American companies employ?
How many Cuba?
1.08%. Why? Cuba was 90 miles from home. Employees of American companies, for them, working in Cuba was a garden of Eden. I mean, middle-class families could now have laundresses and gardeners and cooks and maids, etc. The clear fact was that Batista in the 50s, as Machado before him, had the unconditional support of both U.S. business and the U.S. government. Even when he had been president, Batista had been president and then in fact went to Florida, he came back in March of 1952 to institute a coup to overthrow the legitimate president and retire the much admired Cuban Constitution of 1940. For Cubans who supported Fidel Castro and the guerrillas, defending the nation and defending the revolution became indispensable. It's often hard to speak about the successes of the Cuban Revolution, but I think before we turn to our usual focus on the failures of the revolution, it is important to speak about these successes. There have been substantial successes, but it's also important to note specifically time periods in the evolution of the Cuban Revolution. And when I talk now about successes, I'm talking about the period, the first 30 years of the revolution, from 1959 to 89, before the fall of the Soviet Union, which represented an incredible crisis turning point in the Cuban Revolution. I said as a Latin Americanist, I think Latin America as a political scientist is the most fascinating area in the world to study. And part of the reason for me is the challenge of trying to understand why Latin America has been, for hundreds of years, and remains now, the most unequal point on the planet. Why and what are the consequences of that dominant defining fact of Latin America, inequality? There may be more poverty in India, but there's far less inequality than anywhere in Latin America, even the most equal countries in Latin America. The Cuban Revolution had a dramatic effect in its first 30 years on income distribution and inequality. By the mid-1980s, Cuba's level of equality was on the level of the Nordic countries. And there were specific successes in particular fields. Let's take education. Illiteracy was virtually eliminated in the first years of the revolution. Educational reform became one of the pillars, raising the educational level of Cubans in general, but in particular integrating rural Cubans and women into the educational process. By the end of the 1980s, practically all children up to 17 years of age were enrolled in school, unheard of in the rest of Latin America. Enrollments in higher education in Cuba are today at the level of economically advanced countries and the highest in Latin America. And let me give you one interesting vignette. In 2001, the first region-wide test of primary students was administered by UNESCO. Cuba led Latin America in primary education. Cuban primary students were at or near the top of their peers from across Latin America. In fact, the performance of Cuban third and fourth graders in math and language was so extraordinary that UNESCO decided that their tests had been wrong, that these couldn't be the results. So they went back to Cuba and they retested the Cuban students and found that indeed the results were as astounding as they were before. And this was particularly remarkable given that the test was done in 2001 because of the collapse of the Cuban economy in the 1990s. Healthcare. All medical care in Cuba is free from the beginning years of the revolution. Cuba has been the only country in Latin America with an extensive institutionalized system of free rural and urban health care. Cuban health care in terms of quality is considered the best in Latin America. Cuba today still has the highest ratio of physicians to population, although it is sometimes beaten out by Monaco. As one creative student of Cuban affairs has noted, Cuba has more doctors abroad than the entire World Health Organization. Its doctor-patient ratio is similar to that of Beverly Hills. Cuba's average life expectancy has increased from 58 years on the eve of the revolution to 77 years of age now, similar to the US in terms of global life expectancy rankings. Cuba has the second lowest child mortality rate in the Americas, the US is third, and the lowest per capita HIV/AIDS prevalence. In terms of race, the revolution immediately declared that no one would be barred access to jobs, education, social facilities of any kind because of skin color. And in fact, racial barriers in both the social and labor spheres were lifted in the first years of the revolution. All beaches were declared public property, open to all races. Afro-Cubans were not allowed near many of the popular tourist beaches before the revolution. Afro-Cubans are about 65% of the population, made significant gains to parity with white Cubans in terms of both income and education. In terms of gender, women, it's estimated that anywhere between 9 and 13% of women in Cuba before the revolution were employed outside of the home. 70% of those were employed as domestic servants. Missing from the official statistics were more than 150,000 women working as prostitutes, Cuba being known as the bordello of the Caribbean. The revolution immediately outlawed both prostitution and domestic service as occupations demeaning to women and created schools to retrain servants and prostitutes to be fit for other occupations. By 1984, the female portion of the labor force rose to 38%. By 2007, women were 65% of college graduates in Cuba and 2/3 of all professors. And the Cuban government created innovative policies never instituted in other Marxist regimes, not in China, not in the Soviet Union, not in Vietnam, etc. Example, worker cafeterias in the 70s and 80s, a fifth of the population ate at least one meal there to lessen women's double day. Laundry services were put in effect at workplaces for women. Free birth control. Paid 18 weeks of maternity benefits. My daughter-in-law certainly would have enjoyed that versus the 4 weeks she got, even being a high official in Chicago government. Still, as with education, today, in spite of the dire straits of the economy after the fall of the communist bloc, Cuba in 2016 has the third highest percentage of women legislators in the world. The United States is 97. In sum, by the 80s, there were dramatic indications of success in the Cuban Revolution. The Overseas Development Council created a physical quality of life index to measure and rank life expectancy, infant mortality, and literacy. Cuba ranked above all underdeveloped countries on these variables. Cuba also had the lowest rate of malnutrition in all of Latin America. Susan Eckstein of Boston University has talked about the irony of these successes for Cuba. And what Professor Eckstein means is their very successes created enormous financial burdens for the Cuban government. Example, the longer life expectancy meant the graying of the Cuban population, with the state absorbing the costs of old age. And given the Cuban definition of health, lauded by the World Health Organization, which is not merely the absence of disease, but the state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, the Cuban government had the expense, for example, of establishing thousands of social clubs for its senior citizens. Irony of success because of the Cuban medical system. Cubans die from the same diseases that Americans die from: cancer and cardiovascular disease, much more expensive diseases to treat than the usual diseases of underdevelopment, parasites, malnutrition, etc. Emphasizing these successes in no way takes away from the importance of also noting the failures. The economic failures of the Cuban Revolution have been continual. Even in this first 30-year period, the Cuban government was unable to generate sustained economic growth, nor was it able to escape from the ties of dependency in the first half of the 20th century to the United States. They merely became transferred to the Soviet Union. Political failures, certainly. Cuba does not have a free press or political parties, which has led to the problems that Cuba faces today. The absence of critical public dialogue and debate. There are also the subtle failures of Fidel Castro's leadership. I call them subtle because by and large he has been an incredibly popular authoritarian leader. For those of you who've been to Cuba, one is surprised if you go the first time. There are no pictures of Fidel. There are no statues of Fidel. He has never been accused of corruption, of financial aggrandizement for himself, in contrast, for example, to the Sandinista leaders in Nicaragua, who certainly, were living high off the hog after their victory. But Castro's benign paternalism has always bothered me in the sense of, even when I am in Cuba and Cubans are proudly and passionately defending their revolution to me, I am always struck by the way in which they do it. And they will say, "Luisa, look what the revolution has given to us." Now, I'm mindful of the fact that the villagers I work with in Oaxaca, Mexico would love what the revolution has given to rural Cubans and those living in poverty. But at the same time, I am mindful of the fact that expressing this gratitude, look what the revolution has given to us, is being expressed in an extraordinarily passive way. That is, when I think of revolution, I would want a successful revolution to be about empowerment and agency. And expressing the revolution as a gift given by someone else to me bothers me. And I would certainly count that as one of the failures of the revolution. Whatever the failures, the turning point certainly was the fall of the communist bloc in 1989-90. 85% of Cuba's trade was with the communist bloc at this time. The consequences were devastating. between 90 and 93, the Cuban economy declined by 33%. I was in Cuba in 93 and 94, and at rush hour one would look at the main boulevards in Havana, and there was not a car, there was no gasoline. There were blackouts. It was a devastating time for Cubans. And although we associate some of the market openings that we see in Cuba today with his brother Raúl, it's important to note that it was Fidel Castro in the early 90s who instituted these policies, saying in speech after speech, "Who would have thought we are doing what we are doing?" Legalizing the dollar, making the decision to return to tourism to replace the declining sugar industry, welcoming foreign investment, particularly Spanish investment in tourist infrastructures, hotels, and the like. But Fidel argued we have to do this to save not only the revolution, but to save this country. By the end of the 90s, many of these measures did help, and the economy was stabilized, certainly also helped after 1998 by the largesse of Hugo Chavez and his oil from Venezuela. But these changes also have produced lingering problems for Cuba, about which most Cubans are very worried about today. What do I mean? Inequality is growing and has been growing since the 90s. Example, those in the tourist sector. You're a bartender, you're a guide, you're a taxi driver, you're getting tips in dollars. You're living far better than Cubans who don't have access to that money. Cubans talk about the inverted pyramid. What they mean by that is that the 14-year-old teenager who is leading tours through Old Havana is making more money than his neurosurgeon father. The issues of race, not only growing income inequality, but growing racial inequality again. The new tourist industries, particularly the Spanish hotels, have preferred light-skinned front desk people. An important source of money for Cubans is the remittances sent from relatives in the US. As I said, the Cuban population is about 35% white, 65% black, and mixed. Yet, in the last census here in this country, 84% of the more than 1 million Cubans in the US considered themselves white. Not only were Afro-Cubans not tempted to come to the United States because of our racial problems, but as a group, they've been the strongest supporters of the revolution, given the change in race policy from the extreme discrimination against Afro-Cubans that existed before the revolution. Women, prostitution had been eliminated. With tourism, prostitution has returned with a vengeance to Cuba. And this worries Cubans, whether these unrevolutionary trends will not only continue, but perhaps intensify with the re-engagement with the United States. But let me turn to that re-engagement and talk about Cuba today and tomorrow. One of the most interesting figures in US-Cuban relations is the man that Tom Hanks played in the movie Bridge of Spies. Did anyone see that movie? Okay. He played James Donovan, who was the negotiator to try to exchange powers from the Russian spy. Okay. An amazing figure. Kennedy asked Donovan, that same guy, to be the negotiator, negotiating the release of the more than 1,000 members of the CIA-led disastrous brigade in the Bay of Pigs fiasco in April of 1961. Donovan was the negotiator. Donovan developed and surprising and extraordinary relationship of trust and respect with Fidel Castro. And Donovan recounts the following, giving evidence that even with the break in 61 and 62 with the United States, there was always a desire on the part of Cuba to re-engage. Donovan remembers Fidel saying to him, if any relations were to commence between the US and Cuba, how would it come about and what would be involved? He remembers answering Fidel, and I think, see if you agree with me, this is a classic in diplomatic history. Donovan said to Fidel, now, do you know how porcupines make love? Fidel said, no. And Donovan remembers saying, well, the answer is very carefully. And that is how you and the US will have to get into this. With Donovan, I think we see a pattern that would be replicated in all of the future 10 presidential administrations who confronted the challenge of Cuba, because there was a division in Kennedy's administration. As Donovan continued his shuttle diplomacy in the spring of 1963, some in the Kennedy administration wanted to use his special relationship with Fidel Castro as an opportunity to begin a dialogue toward ending hostilities with Cuba. However, within the CIA, there was another group who saw this special relationship as an opportunity to use both the negotiations and the negotiator as a way to assassinate Fidel Castro. Donovan was going to bring a scuba diving suit as a gift to Fidel on his next visit, and the CIA developed a plot to poison the wetsuit with a fungus which would kill Fidel within hours. It was only when Donovan's CIA handlers intervened that the plot was squashed. U.S. policy remained, after these years, one of antagonism, estrangement, and isolation over the alternative policy that our Canadian and European allies pursued, that is, dialogue and engagement. And since the early 60s, the U.S. has tried everything except direct intervention to force Cuba back into the political and economic orbit of the United States. By the time of George W. Bush, regime change remained the dominant object of U.S. policy. Bush had close ties to Miami's most conservative Cuban Americans. In 2000, they voted 82% Republican, in part punishing Democrats for returning Elian Gonzalez, remember the boy on the raft, back to his father in Cuba. Bush's rationale in 2004 was the same rationale used by the United States government in 1962 for imposing the embargo. Step up the pressure and the regime would collapse. Bush stepped up enforcement of the travel ban, including a 75-year-old grandmother who unwittingly took an illegal bike trip to Cuba. His Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Asset Control had nearly 24 people working on enforcement of the embargo against Cuba, compared to just 2 people investigating Osama bin Laden's finances. The historian Louis Perez Jr. has viewed U.S. policy toward Cuba as an obsession. He argues it became an obsession, particularly within the U.S. State Department, because Castro represented a successful defiance of the United States, a negation of the Monroe Doctrine, that doctrine which said this is legitimately our backyard. It reduced the Monroe Doctrine to a faded scrap of paper, and Perez argues, therefore, the Cuban Revolution had a devastating effect on assumptions of U.S. well-being. And he argues it is in the realm of trauma that is the only way we can understand U.S. policy toward Cuba until 2014. Bush's Commission for Assistance to a Free Cuba published its report in 2004, talking about its goal of subversion, quote, to bring about an expeditious end to the Castro dictatorship through crippling the economy, stroking popular discontent, and thereby precipitating its collapse. He created a democracy promotion program, which by 2008 was funded to the tune of $46 million. Of course, the Cuban response to this was, quote, this is a plan for Cuba's annexation and the return of the fake Republic of the Platte amendment. Enter Obama. Even as a candidate, Obama promised a new beginning in our relationship to Latin America. As a candidate, he said, for example, in 2007, we have been engaged in a failed policy with Cuba for the last 50 years and we need to change it. And as president in 2009, he went to the Summit of the Americas in April and again reiterated, quote, the United States seeks a new beginning with Cuba. I know there's a longer journey that must be traveled to overcome decades of mistrust, but there are critical steps we can take towards a new day. It's interesting to see the difference between Obama's Cuba policy in his first administration and in his second administration. There's a world of difference. In his first term in office, he did ease the ability of Cuban Americans to travel back to the island to visit family and to send money. But he did not do very much more. Cuba was still included as a state sponsor of terrorism, and Obama's budget in 2009, 10, 11 included millions to continue the democracy promotion programs of the Bush era. The programs which landed a man by the name of Alan Gross in jail. Who was Alan Gross? Alan Gross was an American, a contractor for USAID Democracy Promotion Program, who was in Cuba building independent digital networks in Cuban communities that could connect to the internet via satellite, bypassing Cuban servers. He was arrested in December of 2009. His arrest prompted Raul Castro to say, the truth is that the instruments for the policy of aggression to Cuba remain intact, and that the U.S. government does not renounce its efforts to destroy the revolution. John Kerry, our Secretary of State, was then chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. After Gross's arrest, he didn't know very much about the democracy promotion programs. He looked into it, was shocked by what he found. It was run as a covert program. USAID did not know who in Cuba was receiving assistance from their contractors, etc. He wanted to try to cut it back. And as soon as he did that, Senator Menendez of New Jersey called the White House demanding that the Cuba program remain intact, and the Obama administration caved. There were reasons to understand why a new Cuba policy was really not instituted in Obama's first term: political calculation and domestic political realities. Senator Robert Menendez was the senior Cuban American Democrat in Congress, vehemently opposed to any opening to Cuba. He was one of 3 Latinos in the Senate, all Cuban Americans, the others being Republicans Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz. For Obama, this wasn't just Republican opposition. There was not only Menendez in the Senate, there was Debbie Wasserman Schultz, rising star from South Florida, who organized opposition within the Democratic caucus to even ending the travel ban, which was a fairly popular move in the American electorate. So in Obama's first term, he was content to live with the basic continuation of our perpetual antagonism toward Cuba, because in the end, the costs of continuing that policy were relatively low, and the costs of changing that policy entailed domestic political risks that successive presidents and Obama in his first term judged to be too high. However, by his second term, there was a perfect storm brewing for a breakthrough in our policy toward Cuba. And I think there were 4 factors. One was the fact that it was Obama's second term. And it was even Fidel Castro in 1994 who told a group of former ambassadors that he needed a second-term president to normalize relations because no first-term president would have the political courage to do it. And Obama's surprisingly strong showing among Cuban Americans in the 2012 election positioned him well to be that president. He won almost half the Cuban American vote in Florida, far more than any Democrat before him. Second factor, the Cuban American community and the way in which there were enormous changes taking place within it. From 1981 on, it had been the power of conservative anti-Castro Cuban Americans who organized one of the most effective political lobbies ever, a man by the name of Jorge Mascanosa, headed the Cuban American National Foundation, gave this conservative sector of the Cuban American community virtual veto power over U.S. policy. It was a single-minded and strategically concentrated lobby in the key electoral states of Florida and New Jersey. But it was clear to anyone that there were significant attitudinal changes going on within the Cuban American community. The Florida International University has taken polls every year for decades of the Cuban American community. In 1991, 87% of the Cuban Americans in Florida favored the embargo. By 2014, 52% of Cuban Americans opposed it, and 71% of Cuban Americans no longer believed it was effective. In 1993, 75% of Cuban Americans opposed even the sale of food to Cuba. By 2014, 77% of Cuban Americans favored the sale of food to Cuba. Clearly, part of the answer that I'm emphasizing is generational change within the Cuban American community. But it's also important to note something else. That is the different waves of migrants from Cuba. In the 60s and 70s, the Cubans who came were political refugees with a deep hatred for the political goals of the revolution and the Castros. From 1980 on, we have seen increasingly more economic refugees coming from Cuba. These were migrants far more likely to want to retain ties with their family on the island and therefore favor closer U.S. relations with Cuba so they could retain those ties. And some of these economic refugees also appreciate some of the successes of the Cuban Revolution. They weren't the die-hard haters of the first generation. Third factor to create a new U.S. policy. What was happening elsewhere in the Western Hemisphere, particularly in Latin America? The U.S. has paid a very heavy diplomatic price for its Cuba policy, particularly in the last couple of decades when left-of-center governments became dominant in Latin America, in Bolivia, in Ecuador, in Bolivia, in Ecuador, in Venezuela, in Argentina, even with moderate social democrats like Lula and Rousseff in Brazil, Michelle Bachelet in Chile. These leaders totally rejected U.S. policy of hostility to Cuba. At the Fifth Summit of the Americas in 2009, Latin American presidents made it clear that U.S.-Cuba policy would be the litmus test to see if Obama really wanted to create a new relationship with Latin America. And by 2012, at the Sixth Summit of the Americas in Colombia, when it was clear that U.S. policy was virtually unchanged from what it had been, even conservative Colombian President Santos said he wouldn't come to the next summit if Cuba continued to be excluded. Reportedly, Obama was taken aback by the vehemence of Latin American leaders' objections to our Cuba policy. He had clearly, and his aides had clearly underestimated the anger building in Latin America over the Cuba issue. And it was only a few months after he came back from this summit that he decided to open this secret dialogue with Cuba. The fourth factor was the change in leadership in Cuba. You know, Fidel became ill in 2006, said he was temporarily handing over power to his brother. That became permanent in 2008. Raúl is not Fidel. He has focused on domestic problems. Anti-US diatribes feature much less prominently in his speeches. He has blamed Cuba's economic problems on the shortcomings of Cuba policy, not merely on the embargo. His solution to Cuba's economic problems was to pursue a Cuban-style market socialism, reminiscent, I would say, most closely with that of Vietnam. He has expanded the small private sector, sought direct foreign investment, unleashed market forces in agriculture, legalized the purchase of cell phones and computers, the private sale of autos and real estate, lifted the ban on Cubans staying in tourist hotels, signed 2 human rights agreements, freed a number of political prisoners, etc. It's perhaps fitting that the first contact and the first handshake between Raúl Castro and Obama came in December 2013 at the memorial service for Nelson Mandela, such an amazing symbol of forgiveness and reconciliation. Evidently, Raúl Castro said, walked up to Obama and said, "Mr. President, I am Castro." Whereupon Obama said, "I know." All of this allowed for the December 2014 historic announcement of rapprochement. Obama had the courage to take that one bold step to fundamentally change the relationship, even though it did and does not resolve every issue. The announcement represented a fundamental reorientation of U.S. policy. It represented the United States' acceptance that the Cuban government was not going to disappear anytime soon, and that U.S. policy would henceforth be to coexist with it rather than to try to overthrow it. This was just the first bold step. Clearly, we all know that there are huge problems that remain, both in the United States and in Cuba. In Cuba, there is a right wing that is very skeptical of the new relationship with the United States. There's the worry that I indicated before, made all the more intense by the rapprochement with the United States of how to maintain the revolution, the concern, can we be half capitalist and half socialist? Is that a viable goal? And the concern is revealed in a whole series of announcements in Cuba, one being, for example, a recent announcement that the concentration of property and wealth will be totally intolerable, not tolerated in Cuba. In the United States, of course, particularly because of our election perhaps, even more worries. There are those, particularly in Congress, who insist on reinstating the historic conditionality of re-engagement. That is, what Obama did that was different was remove the one condition that we said we would stand by until this moment. That is that Cuba had to have a market economy and a multi-party democratic system. That condition from previous administrations, and even the beginning of the Obama administration, was of course the one condition that the Cubans could never accept. For them, their revolution was about sovereignty, autonomy, and self-determination. So it was Obama's breakthrough that he could forego that condition, continue to say we have differences and concerns about democracy and human rights, but through re-engagement, we can work more fruitfully on those differences than we could with our previous policy of hostility. Many of Obama's opponents hope to show that he's simply been duped by the Cubans. They're hoping for missteps. And do remember that despite the agreements and the reestablishment of relations, the US has not agreed to dismantle the multiplicity of programs supporting the old policy of regime change. The core of the US embargo remains in place. The Helms-Burton Act of 1996, and the updating of the embargo, says, one, that the embargo can only be changed by an act of Congress, and written into Helms-Burton, into law, is that the US cannot re-engage while a Castro is in power, and that Cuba must have a democratic government to re-engage. Clearly, there are problems ahead. It is probably easier to go backwards in the United States than it is in Cuba. It is clear that Raul Castro is committed to domestic reform. He has expressed the view several times that the great irony of the Cuban Revolution would be if those who made the revolution would be the responsible ones for losing it after that generation were gone. He is absolutely committed to internal reform to prevent that, and one does get the sense in Cuba that the changes unleashed are irreversible. But history is not in the past in the US. Not only is there still the embargo, Obama can punch holes in it, as he did his last foray yesterday, which is in the news today. Now Americans can buy as much Cuban rum and Cuban cigars as they want. There are no more limits. There are other important aspects announced yesterday, such as Cuban pharmaceuticals, if approved by the FDA, can now be sold in the US. US retailers can sell online goods to Cuba. He can punch holes in it, but it's still there. And the election, I'll end on this note, is complicating it. For example, Obama has weakened the financial blockade. US companies are now allowed to use dollars in Cuba, but this still hasn't been done. The problem is the banks. They are not letting money go through because of the election. They're fearing that with a change in policy, they would be fined millions of dollars later. Trump originally came out in favor of re-engagement, said he wanted to open a hotel in Cuba. In a talk last month in Miami, he reversed himself and said he would absolutely reverse Obama's policy if he were president. Hillary has accepted re-engagement. During her years as Secretary of State, she more closely than the Obama of his second term towed a hard line with Cuba, favoring conditionality. In a speech a few weeks ago in Miami, she said, she's supporting Obama, but there's a sort of more of a hard frame to her comments than we get from Obama these days. She said to her Miami audience, engagement is not a gift to the Castros, it's a threat to the Castros. An American embassy in Havana is not a concession, it is a beacon. So we are left with many obstacles in this historic relationship. But I think the obstacles to be faced now in no way should detract from the significance of the steps that both Presidents Obama and Castro have taken. They have replaced a Cold War framework of hostility with a 21st century policy of engagement and cooperation. It has taken enormous vision and courage on both sides to do that, and we will need more vision and courage to overcome the unfortunate history of mistrust and hostility that has characterized the relationship between the US and Cuba up until now. Thank you, and I'm sorry. Questions for anyone? Yes?
You didn't mention the book at all.
Very important. The announcement of December 17, both Obama and Castro thanked Pope Francis for urging this reconciliation. He's played a very important and supportive role. Very, very. Yes?
When you talk about conditionality in terms of U.S. foreign policy, has the United States ever had any kind of conditionality that approaches the one that it held with Cuba? For me, the argument has always been that we've tolerated and engaged with so many
China,
left, not even Marxist states, but left and right-wing Latin American dictators,
right.
Left, right, and center. That
right.
This just seemed like an absurd 30 years out of date personal vendetta that we've been carrying on.
Well, in part because of Florida, those 25 electoral votes, and the geographical concentration of Cuban migrants, Cuba became, it wasn't a foreign policy issue.
No, correct.
It was a domestic issue. And, the Cuban American National Foundation, headed by Jorge Mascanosa, modeled themselves on the Israeli lobby.
Of course they did.
They were absolutely strategic about being the veto power, the mover of U.S.-Cuba policy. And for years, they were tremendously successful. I had a student, I think in the early 90s, who wanted to do a honors thesis on the Cuban American National Foundation. And we got her money to go and interview people in Washington about the Cuba lobby. This was an undergraduate. She made all sorts of calls. People, didn't respond. The Cuban American National Foundation responded, picked her up at the airport with a limo. This was extraordinary. This was an undergraduate student. They were so organized and so strategic. Jorge Mascanosa got sick. His son did not have the talent that he had to lead this. lobby. And it was also true that generational change and the different type of migrants coming from Cuba, helped to shift. What is happening now with Florida and the election, it will be interesting to see. Obama in 2012 won 50% of the Cuban American vote. Even in 2008, he won 35% of the Cuban American vote versus 25% for Kerry in 2004. How Trump is going to change these figures, quién sabe. Really interesting. Yes?
I'm in an environmental studies class here on Latin American food systems, and we've talked a lot about basically the monopoly that American fruit companies like Del Monte and
United Fruit.
United Fruit, like the dollar banana trade essentially, and how they can force United States policymakers to do what they're bidding essentially. Do you think that they have any power over what might happen with Cuba in agriculture?
Very good question, complicated answer. It is clear that Cuba can easily become very dependent on the United States in terms of agriculture. Obama's new hole punching in the embargo yesterday allowed, for example, credit financing for agricultural products from the United States like tractors and pesticides. This is important because until now, we have insisted that the Cubans pay cash for anything agricultural from the United States. I don't think, one of the great economic failures of the revolution is Cuban agriculture. I think the reassertion of tourism as a dominant part of the economy, very complicated decision. People are second guessing whether they should have made that decision, whether they should have tried to revitalize the sugar industry, think of the importance of ethanol, etc. Tourism is a funny industry. What kind of jobs does it create? More maids? More bellboys? What kind of skills does tourism as an industry for a developing country really bring to the population? It brings cash, which brings increased racial and economic inequality. It brings, the Cuban Federation of Women is crazed by the tourism industry in terms of the girly shows from the 1950s, the strippers, the prostitutes. But those companies played an important part in the revolution. Fidel Castro's father was a wealthy landowner, originally from Spain, but he owned land in the poorest province of Cuba, Oriente, where United Fruit Company was dominant. So he may have been wealthy, but he was a firebrand of a Cuban nationalist because of United Fruit, which he certainly passed on to his son, who must have been a handful, because at 13 he organized his father's workers against his father. Yes.
What's happened with Senator Menendez's positions? And we live in Arizona, where Senator Flake, a Republican, had been pushing for a new relationship with Cuba. How important is that?
I haven't followed the corruption scandal that broke in 2015 with Menendez, so I'm really not up on that. What's so interesting about the push for re-engage are the strange bedfellows pushing for that. Chambers of Commerce. The farmers. All these groups who you would think would be opposed to re-engagement. They feel the fact that Cuba opened in the 90s and European and Canadian money rushed in, feel that the U.S. and U.S. business has lost and is losing because of the embargo. So you have many organizations and groups who have been pushing for a new policy and the end of the embargo that we've never seen together in the same push for a diplomatic opening. Yes.
And just following up on the agricultural question, do you know much about Cuba's natural resource management? Like how are there national parks, and environmentally, how are they rated?
Well, you know, with the fall of the Soviet Union, the country, as I said, was totally devastated. Cubans took that opportunity, but I think a lot of it was hype, saying we are the world's greatest environmentalists now. That is, we have no gasoline, so we can't have, you know, what they did was import massive numbers of bikes from China. And the first generation of those bikes, can you imagine Cubans carrying those heavy Chinese bikes up 5 flights of stairs? I mean, gradually they got lighter bikes and got them from elsewhere, not just China. But they talked about, they tooted their environmental horn, saying, because they didn't have access to pesticides, we're doing organic gardening, we're concerned about the climate and climate change. I think on one hand, I mean, one of the things you have to say about Fidel Castro, besides the fact that no man should be in power that long, is that he was totally consistent. I mean, read his speeches from the 1960s and some of his addresses before he became in at the United States. He was talking about the importance of the environment. He was talking about food safety and the importance of producing food, not defining development in terms of industrialization, the importance of focusing on agriculture. So that Cuba has done a lot of organic gardening. They are very prideful of that, but I also think that some of it was of necessity. I mean, in the end, we talk about the economic failures of the revolution. Is the failure because of the socialist model that the revolution used? Is it because of the embargo? Is it because that this is a small island without a lot of resources? Hey, we got some nickel. And for a while we had a thriving sugar industry. But, you know, we often don't think, as we think of development, of the environmental and resource quality of the base with which a country has to move forward in terms of economic development. I mean, what does an island like Cuba do in the 21st century?
I ask because I was a Peace Corps volunteer in the Dominican Republic, and I've always been so fascinated in the way, you know, like the resources have been managed under different systems of government. I'd love to do some kind of comparison.
Great project.
Yeah, like
And compare with Puerto Rico now, that's struggling with their losing all of their incentives, but they haven't replaced any of their hotels in 35 years.
Yeah, but Puerto Rico, you know, because they've been basically subsidized by the United States, their natural resources are in great shape. You know, it's all secondary growth force, but
Full disclosure, I've been in the travel and tourism industry my entire career, so I'm biased there. But I mean, my first time to the Dominican Republic, you look at the strip of hotels on the beach in Punta Cana, it's stunning. And my first thought was, why was this not developed until the late 80s? Well, the answer is Trujillo, of course. But if you're an island in the sun,
you're limited.
Your ability to sell.
Both of you raise really fascinating questions. I mean, remember that Cuba today is a country that does not even have a domestic construction company. 110 flights a day now are starting from the United States. Only 20 a day to Havana. There are going to be 10 each to the 9 other cities in Cuba that have international airports. There are now 2,000 Airbnb sites and growing on the island. There were 9,000 casa particulares, private homes opening themselves to tourists in 2014, 9,000. It's expected that there will be 19,000 by the end of 2016. Cuba is anticipating by the end of the year having had 4 million tourists, mainly the rest of the world who wants to get there before we do. I mean, how is Cuba going to handle this? My last trip to Cuba, I spent a month there. I was in a government hotel. It was the hotel built on the eve of the revolution by Meyer Lansky. It is the only hotel, because Cuba was so Americanized, that would put carpeting in the rooms in a tropical climate. The carpeting in my room probably hadn't been changed in the 50 years of the revolution. Everyone in the group that I was a part of got sick from mold. I mean, there are real issues on how the tourist advantage, and it's important now, given the fact that tourism is such a dominant part of the economy, how that is going to be handled in Cuba and how the government can do it and the kind of quality control. I mean, it may well be overwhelming. Yeah.
My cousin actually has made, I think, 2 trips now as a part of like ambassador liaison thing with startups in Cuba. And he argues that tourism might not be the best thing for Cuba, and instead that tech startups and business startups like that would be the best thing. Like, what's your opinion on that?
You know, there was a Harvard Business School case study 15 or 20 years ago. And it made a very important argument, I think. Is Cuba using its unique resources in the way that it should? What are its unique resources? It has the most educated population in Latin America. Is tourism the way to use that? How can Cuba use its unique assets in the best way for the country's development? This is the big debate now and in the future for Cuba. Yeah. And how can it, I was shocked when I was there in 2013 walking around Old Havana. I felt it was not too different from walking around Nantucket or Key West, you know, the eyeglass stores. I mean, you knew you were in Cuba because of the music and the mojitos. You know, how do Cubans prevent Cuba from looking like the Cuba of the 1950s? That's a great, great challenge that I think it faces today. Yes?
Do you think medical tourism would be a nice way to synthesize the two assets?
Cuba has had medical tourism, huge medical tourism. You know, the Cubans, it's wonderful now that Cuban pharmaceuticals can come to the States because of the embargo. It was a woman scientist who developed a meningitis vaccine that is used elsewhere in the world, but not here in the United States. Medical tourism for very sophisticated heart and other organ transplants have been going on for years in Cuba. But I think this, again, even emphasizing that is just such a small piece of the pie. It's going to be very interesting to sort of come back at another homecoming weekend, let's say 2 or 3 years from now, and have a reunion as to what's been happening in Cuba. Yes.
What about the succession? I mean, Castro's quite old now.
He
What
is.
is known about that, and could things be reversed?
No, you know, I don't think so. He said some very surprising things that, you know, no leader should be over 70 in the future, that there should be term limits. that he will not run again for president. I mean, remember, Castro last August 13th, Fidel Castro turned 90. This is his younger brother, but he's in his 80s. There are indications that there are younger people that the regime is grooming, not the people that one thought with Fidel who would take over. There's been a real shakeup with that. But, you know, if you've seen pictures of what's happening in Cuba, where suddenly the red, white, and blue and the stars and stripes have become the most elegant forms of dress by Cubans, the welcoming of the first Carnival cruise ship by, you know, scores of Cubans cheering. It has been really hard to be a Cuban nationalist, because the economic hardship has been tremendous. I remember when I was there in the 90s, and in the home of a female Cuban journalist who, in the middle of the conversation, walked over to her refrigerator, opened it up, and turned to me and said, "Who would have ever thought? I've given my life for the revolution, that I would open my refrigerator and there's hardly any food in it." On the other hand, she then, after a minute, said to me, "You know, my son just went on a government mission to Rio de Janeiro, and he came back and he told me, even if we don't have all the food we want to eat now, at least our children aren't begging on the streets as they were in Rio." So even people who were fervently for the revolution have not had an easy time being loyal to the revolution because of the hardships, for whatever reason, the failures, the economic failures of the Cuban Revolution. Thank you very much for